Scene 8. Keiko's return. Keiko returned the next afternoon, and her arrival silenced the entire barracks. She was bandaged properly, her arm in a white sling, pain medication evident in the slight glaze to her eyes. But more striking than her physical appearance was her expression. She looked not happy exactly. That would be too simple a word. She looked stunned, confused, as though she had been taken to another world and was struggling to reconcile what she had experienced with what she had expected. The women crowded around her as soon as the guards allowed it. Questions poured out in urgent Japanese. What was it like? Were you hurt? Did they... The question hung unfinished, but everyone understood what they were asking. Keiko sat down slowly, moving carefully to protect her injured arm, and began to speak. Her voice was quiet, almost dreamlike. The hospital, she said, is the cleanest place I have ever been. That was not what they expected to hear. Fumiko found herself leaning forward, her curiosity suddenly overwhelming her fear. Everything is white, Keiko continued. The walls, the sheets, the uniforms of the nurses, the floors are polished so much they reflect the light. There are windows everywhere, and the air is cool. They have machines I have never seen before, machines just for taking pictures of broken bones. But what about the people? Akiko pressed. The doctors, the nurses, did they treat you well? They called me Miss Keiko, Keiko said, and her voice cracked slightly. An American doctor, a tall man with gray hair, he looked at my arm and said, "We're going to make sure you heal well. This is going to be just fine." His words were translated by the interpreter, but I understood the tone. He meant it. Fumiko felt her eyes burning. She was not sure if it was from relief or from something deeper, something more complicated than simple relief. Keiko continued her account. She had been taken to a hospital ward. She had been given a bed by a window. Nurses, American women, had changed her bandages, brought her medicine for pain, offered her water and food. A woman doctor had examined her arm, explaining each step of what she was doing, making sure Keiko understood and was comfortable. In Japan, Keiko said slowly, as if working through the realization even as she spoke, I was a military medic. I saw wounded soldiers. We did what we could with the supplies we had. Many died. The doctors were competent, but they were not... She struggled for the word. Kind is not the right word. They were professional, efficient. But this was different. Different how? Fumiko asked. There was time, Keiko said. They did not rush through my examination. The doctor explained what was wrong. The nurse asked if I was comfortable if the bandage was too tight. They gave me pain medication without me asking. When I was hungry, they brought food. When I was confused about what was happening, they explained. She paused, looking at each of the women gathered around her. I asked the nurse why they were being so careful with me. I am a Japanese prisoner. Japan is their enemy. We dropped bombs on their cities. We killed their soldiers, and they were being... Keiko's voice wavered. Careful. What did she say? Yuki asked quietly. She said that their job was to heal people, that being a prisoner didn't change that everyone deserves to be treated with respect when they are hurt or ill. The barracks fell silent. It was a simple statement, but it contradicted everything they had been taught about warfare, about enemies, about the nature of military conflict. Scene 9. The hospital visits continue. Over the next weeks, several more women found reasons to visit the hospital. Some had legitimate medical concerns that required more advanced care than the camp clinic could provide. Others suspected they might have things wrong with them, ailments that could be treated in that impossible place Keiko had described. Each woman returned with a similar story. The hospital was immaculate. The doctors were professional and competent. The nurses treated them with courtesy that felt shocking in its consistency. They were given meals on trays. They were offered coffee or tea. They were asked about their comfort and their pain levels. One woman, a communication specialist named Yuriko, developed an infection in a wound she had sustained before capture. It had been treated inadequately, and by the time she reached the hospital, it required antibiotics and careful wound management. She spent 2 days in the hospital while American doctors and nurses worked to save her arm. When she returned to the barracks, she was emotional in a way that none of them had been prepared to witness. "They saved my arm," Yuriko said over and over. "In Japan, they would have amputated it. I would have been useless. But here they gave me medicine that cost money, that used resources, for a Japanese prisoner, a woman who is their enemy." "Why?" Fumiko asked. "Why would they do that?" Yuriko shook her head slowly. "I asked. The doctor told me that prisoners deserve medical care, that it was part of the Geneva Convention, but it was more than that. I could see it in their faces. They genuinely wanted me to be well." Scene 10. Fumiko's turn. It was inevitable that Fumiko herself would eventually need hospital care. The infection in her arm, the one that had been treated at intake, had initially improved but had never fully healed. In August, she developed a fever, and Dr. Harrison, who regularly visited the camp for inspections, immediately recommended that she be transferred to the hospital for proper treatment. Fumiko found herself on the same transport truck that had carried Keiko, riding down roads that took her away from the familiar confines of Camp Polk and toward the larger American military installation where the hospital was located. She was terrified in a way that surprised her. The camp had become, in some strange way, familiar. She knew its routines. She understood its rhythms. The hospital was unknown. And despite everything that Keiko and Yuriko and the others had told her, there was still a part of her that feared that this was where the veneer of civilization would drop away. The hospital appeared through the truck window like something from an American film. It was a large brick building, newer than most of the camp structures, with wide windows and a columned entrance. American flags flew from poles. Ambulances and military vehicles were parked in neat rows. A nurse met her at the entrance. An American woman, perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and an air of complete professional competence. "Welcome," the nurse said through an interpreter. "You're Fumiko, correct? I'm Nurse Margaret. We're going to get you feeling better." The intake process for the hospital was thorough and once again entirely professional. Fumiko was taken to a room, an actual room, not a bed in a ward, where she was asked to change into a hospital gown. A doctor came to examine her, listened to her chest with a stethoscope, looked at her arm, asked questions about her symptoms. The fever was from an infection that had gone undetected. It required antibiotics and careful monitoring. She would need to stay in the hospital for at least 3 days. She was given a bed by a window. Clean sheets. A blanket that felt like it was made from actual cotton, not the rougher material of camp bedding. A nightstand with a lamp. A chair. The other patients in the ward were all American soldiers, men with various injuries and illnesses. When they saw Fumiko, there was a moment of surprise, but then they simply nodded at her and went back to their own recovery. A nurse came in with a tray of food. Soup that actually tasted like it was made from broth, not water. Bread that was soft and fresh. Fruit, an apple, something Fumiko had not tasted in months. "Eat as much as you can," the nurse said. "Your body needs fuel to fight the infection." Over the next 3 days, Fumiko experienced something that could not be easily categorized. She was ill, certainly. Her fever was high enough that she spent hours in a state of semi-consciousness. But even in that fever state, she was aware of being cared for in a way that she had never experienced before. Nurses checked on her hourly. They brought her cool water to drink. They changed her bedding when she sweated through it. When she was anxious or confused, they spoke to her gently and explained what was happening. When she was in pain, they gave her medicine. When she needed to use the toilet, they helped her, maintaining her dignity even in that vulnerability. Dr. Harrison visited her on the second day. He examined her arm, looked at her chart, and said, "The infection is responding to treatment. You're going to be fine. In a few days, you'll be back to normal." It was said with such certainty, such confidence, that Fumiko found herself believing him. Scene 11. The breaking point. On the third morning in the hospital, Fumiko woke to find that her fever had broken. She felt weak, but clear-headed for the first time in days. Sunlight was streaming through the window. The hospital was quiet, the normal morning routines not yet in full swing. A nurse came in, a younger woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with blonde hair and a direct manner, to check Fumiko's vital signs. "Your temperature's normal," the nurse said, checking the thermometer. That's wonderful news. How are you feeling? Better, Fumiko replied in halting English. Much better. The nurse smiled. I'm glad. Dr. Harrison will probably discharge you today. You'll go back to your camp and you should be able to return to light duties within a week or so. Fumiko nodded. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt something breaking open inside her. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of maintaining fear for so long. Perhaps it was the contradiction between everything she had been taught and everything she was experiencing. Perhaps it was simply that she had run out of emotional resources to keep processing the impossible. As the nurse was leaving the room, Fumiko heard her own voice, speaking in English words she had learned from listening to guards and interpreters, her accent thick but her meaning clear. Are you angels? The nurse stopped and turned back. She looked at Fumiko, and her expression, one of surprise and sudden understanding, made it clear that she comprehended what Fumiko was really asking. No, honey, the nurse said softly. She sat down on the edge of Fumiko's bed. We're not angels. We're just people. People who believe that everyone deserves to be taken care of when they're sick, no matter where they come from or what country they're from, or whether we're at war with them. It was such a simple statement. But to Fumiko, who had been raised in a world where mercy was a luxury, where kindness was a weapon to be used strategically, where the hierarchy of military life meant that your value as a human being was determined by your rank and your usefulness, it was revolutionary. She looked at the nurse, at her clean uniform, her clear eyes, her hands that had bandaged wounds and adjusted pillows and brought water without any expectation of reward or recognition, and something inside Fumiko gave way. She began to cry. The nurse simply sat there, not offering platitudes, not trying to explain or justify or make it better. Just sitting with her while she processed the reality that her understanding of the world had been, in many fundamental ways, wrong. Part 4. The Transformation Scene. 12. Return to Camp. When Fumiko returned to Camp Polk, she was different. Not physically, though the infection had cleared and her arm was healing well. But internally, something had shifted. She returned to the barracks with an authority that came not from any official designation, but from experience. She had been to the hospital. She had been treated with dignity and competence by the people she had been taught to fear. She had experienced a level of medical care that went beyond mere survival into something approaching the philosophy of healing as a human right rather than a military commodity. The other women gathered around her as they had gathered around Keiko and Yuriko. But Fumiko's account was different. She did not describe the hospital with wonder, though there was wonder in it. She described it as a revelation. They have machines that see inside your body without cutting, she said. They have medicines that stop infections. They have time, actual time, to spend caring for each patient. And it is not because they are rich or powerful or deserve it. It is because they believe that being sick is enough of a reason to deserve care. That's madness, Akiko said, but her voice had lost its cynicism. No military can operate that way. Apparently this one does, Fumiko replied. I think this might be why they are winning the war. The statement hung in the air. It was dangerous in a way. It contradicted the propaganda they had all absorbed, but more and more women were arriving at the same conclusion. The Americans' strength was not just in their weapons or their numbers. It was in their systems. It was in their belief that humans had inherent dignity that could not be stripped away, even in war. Scene 13. The ripple effect. Over the following weeks, more women found themselves needing hospital care. Some had genuine medical issues. Others perhaps exaggerated symptoms or visited the camp clinic with complaints that might not have risen to the level of concern in other circumstances. But the camp doctors and interpreters seemed to understand what was happening. Each time a woman returned from the hospital, she returned transformed in some way. Not traumatized, not broken by what she had witnessed. Changed by the recognition that mercy existed on a scale she had not thought possible. The camp itself began to shift in response to these stories. Women spoke more openly about their treatment, about the apparent contradiction between the enemy they had been taught to expect and the military personnel they actually encountered. Some women began to improve their English, learning words and phrases not just to follow orders, but to communicate more directly with the Americans around them. The guards, for their part, began to notice the change. The tension that had characterized the early weeks of captivity was replaced by something more complex, a kind of quiet coexistence where both sides understood the rules and, increasingly, understood that the rules were designed to protect rather than to oppress. One afternoon, as Fumiko was helping to tend the garden, a guard, a young man from Iowa named Private Samuel Chen, paused in his patrol to watch the work. In previous weeks, he would have moved on after a moment. This time, he lingered. "The plants look good," he said to the interpreter, who happened to be standing nearby. The interpreter translated into Japanese. Fumiko looked up from the tomato plants she was watering. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "We are trying to make something grow in a place made for war." The guard seemed to consider this. Then he nodded, and a very slight smile crossed his face before he continued his patrol. It was a moment of human connection, brief and constrained by the rules that governed the camp, but real, nonetheless. Scene 14. Letters home. By the second month of captivity, the mail program had expanded. Women were allowed to write every 10 days instead of every 2 weeks. Letters began to flow from the camp across the Pacific to Japanese families who were desperate for news of their loved ones. The letters that women wrote had evolved. The early messages of bare survival, "I am alive," had been replaced by more detailed accounts. Not propaganda or political statements, but simple descriptions of their days. The food they were eating, the work they were doing, the weather in Texas, the fact that they were receiving medical care. Censors read every letter, but they appeared to be censoring only for security violations, not for any other reason. If Fumiko wanted to write that an American nurse had treated her infection with antibiotics, that was allowed. If Keiko wanted to describe the hospital in detail, that was permitted. If Yuriko wanted to tell her family that she still had her arm, that she had American doctors to thank for it, that was not struck out. Fumiko wrote to her mother, "I have seen things that contradict everything I was taught. I have been hurt, yes, but not by cruelty. I have been healed by people I was told were my enemy. I am a prisoner, but I do not live in the darkness I expected. I do not know what this means for Japan or for the war or for my future, but I know that the world is more complicated than I was taught, and that mercy exists even in the places where we least expect to find it." The letter was censored, but it passed through. It reached her mother 3 weeks later, and that letter would change the shape of how that family understood the war, and America, and the meaning of being human.